He used to bring her wildflowers and say she was magic. Now he brings another woman to events and pretends not to see his wife. She stood across the room, in a gown she didn't even pick, makeup someone else applied, smiling through the ache. All night, he avoided her gaze. But what shattered her wasn't the silence. It was his laugh. Low, careless, cruel. "She means well," he said, nodding toward her, "but come on. She doesn't belong in this world. She didn't belong. Not next to him. Not in the room. Not in the life she helped him build." And that's when she knew. The man who once told her she was rare now mocked her like she was replaceable. Before we dive in, if you believe in second chances, self-worth, and stories that stir the soul, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and join the Mr. Ross story trail. Because here, every story reminds you, you are not invisible. Have you ever been overlooked by someone who once claimed they loved you? What do you do when someone you gave your life to rewrites the story without you in it? When the person who once memorized every line of your face now scrolls past you like you're no longer worth the attention? Do you shrink? Do you scream? Do you stay silent so your children don't hear your heartbreaking? Isolde didn't yell that night. She didn't fight, didn't storm out, didn't collapse in the bathroom the way so many do. She waited until her children were asleep, their little breaths steady, their world still safe. And then she sat in the dark with her hands in her lap and made a decision. Not for revenge, not for attention, for herself. Because one day, every woman wakes up and realizes being invisible to someone else doesn't mean you stop existing. It means it's time to become someone they can't ignore. She opened her notebook. She wrote one word at the top of the page. Unseen. That word would become the anthem that shook millions and brought her husband to tears on live television. Months later, the man who once laughed at her stood in front of a flat screen, champagne, glass in hand, next to the woman he used to deny was more than a business partner. He wasn't watching a concert. He was watching a reckoning. Because there she was, Isolde, hair free, eyes steady, voice calm, dressed in emerald green that shimmered like strength. She didn't look like someone desperate for approval. She looked like someone who had outgrown his silence. And when she sang that first note, something inside him collapsed. He knew the song wasn't just for the crowd. It was for every woman who ever felt erased. It was for him, the man who forgot that diamonds don't beg to be noticed. They shine regardless. He had everything: money, power, influence. But in that moment, he had nothing. She didn't need revenge. She needed a microphone. And that night, the whole world heard her. There's a certain kind of woman the world learns to overlook, the kind who doesn't speak loudly in crowds, the kind who never needed spotlights to feel real, the kind whose beauty blooms slowly, not in flashes, but in quiet glances that linger longer than most people are willing to look. Isolde was that kind of woman. She lived in a small town curled between hills and water, where people knew each other. His birthdays, and the baker always added an extra roll on Sundays if you were kind. She worked at the local art center, painting with children, organizing community, mural projects, and cleaning up long after everyone else had gone home. Her hair was always tied up, her shirts were always soft with wear, and her eyes, deep hazel, like soil, after rain, held the kind of stillness people didn't understand until they were drowning in noise. Men didn't stop and stare at her, but if they ever did, really did, they'd realize there was something about her that felt like home. She smiled like she knew secrets but would never use them against you. She laughed like it was for her own joy, not anyone else's approval. And she listened. The kind of listening that makes you feel like your words matter, even when they don't make much sense. Then came Kyle. He wasn't from the town. He came from cities where everyone spoke quickly and dressed sharply. A tech entrepreneur. All clean lines, expensive watches, fast ideas. He arrived for a charity event the town hosted every spring, the kind with hay rides, face painting, and booths filled with handmade jam and stories passed down over fences. He wasn't supposed to stay long. But then, he saw her. She was helping a group of children paint a mural on the side of the library. Her hands were covered in color, her shirt smudged with green and sky blue. A little girl had just dropped a brush, and Isolde bent down, wiped the child's cheek with her sleeve, and smiled in that way she always did, like being needed was the greatest privilege in the world. Kyle watched for 20 minutes before saying a word. Not because he was shy, he never had been, but because for once, words felt like they might ruin something. When he finally approached, she glanced at him and said, "You're standing too close to the wet paint." That's how it started. Over the weeks that followed, Kyle found reasons to come back. Business meetings became flexible. His phone calls grew shorter. Every excuse led him back to that little town where the air felt easier, and she kept showing up in her quiet grace, never trying to impress, never trying to be anything but herself. They'd eat pie at her grandmother's house, cinnamon always warm, crust always too soft to be sold but perfect for someone who mattered. They'd sit on benches overlooking the water, where she'd talk about nothing in particular, and somehow he always felt like he was hearing something profound. She didn't chase him. She didn't flatter him. She just was. And in a world that praised loud confidence, she was the first person he met who made stillness feel like power. Kyle fell in love slowly. And then, all at once. At first, he told himself it was curiosity, a passing fascination, something about the way she moved through the world without needing to perform for it. But fascination doesn't make a man drive 2 hours just to watch someone refill paint jars at a school fundraiser. It doesn't make him cancel a conference call just to sit with her on her porch, watching dusk turn the hills gold. With Isolde, everything slowed down, not in a boring way, in a way that reminded him he was alive. She'd pour coffee into chipped mugs. He'd bring pastries that were too fancy for the town bakery. They'd talk about books, kids in the community, his company, the way her mother used to hum when folding clothes. Nothing that changed the world, but everything that made it feel real. She asked questions no one else did, not about mergers or press coverage or what car he drove. She asked why he hadn't visited his sister lately, why he rubbed his left thumb when he was anxious, why he didn't sing even though he clearly knew all the words to the songs on the radio. She didn't want his resume. She wanted him. One night, while walking home from a local bonfire, he stopped under the string. Lights someone had hung between 2 oak trees and just looked at her. She was barefoot. Her hair was falling loose from the usual bun. She was humming something under her breath, holding her sandals in one hand. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "why no one's seen you like this before?" She raised an eyebrow. "Seen me how?" He searched for the words, all of them inadequate, and finally said, like a quiet kind of miracle. She laughed, soft and surprised. Maybe they never stopped long enough to look. The night he told her he loved her, it was raining softly outside her window, the kind of hush that wraps around everything like a blanket. She was wearing a sweater 2 sizes too big and reading a children's book she planned to donate. He didn't say it like a man offering a gift. He said it like a man telling the truth. "I think I loved you before I even knew your name." She looked up, startled. "You don't even know all of me." "I don't need to," he said. "I can feel it in my chest, like something important is finally in the right place." She didn't answer with words. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and that was enough. Months passed like seasons in fast motion. Kyle took her to places she never thought she'd see, small gallery showings, intimate dinner parties, weekend trips where the horizon stretched so far it felt like the world had opened a little wider just for them. She felt unsure sometimes, not because she didn't trust him, but because the life he lived was full of people who never forgot to be impressive. And yet, he always looked at her like she was the most extraordinary thing in the room. Their wedding wasn't extravagant. It was sacred. Golden light spilled across a lake where swans drifted like poetry. A wooden dock became the aisle. Folding chairs lined with wildflowers became pews. She wore a simple dress with lace on the sleeves. He wore a navy suit and a smile that didn't fade once. They said vows written by hand, promises like, "I'll never stop seeing your soul, no matter what the world says." And everyone who watched them believed it. Because in that moment, they weren't the man from the city and the woman from the hills. They were 2 hearts that had finally found a home. The early years were gentle. They built a home near the river, white shutters, a garden with too many sunflowers, and a porch where laughter settled like dust. On quiet nights, he'd read aloud to her while she painted on scrap paper, little swirls, trees, suns with smiling faces, never anything serious, just whatever her hands wanted to say. When their son, Oren, was born, Kyle cried before she did. He held him like the world might fall apart if he let go. 2 years later came Lyra, sharp, curious, with her mother's eyes. Isolde used to sing lullabies until both children fell asleep in her lap, and Kyle. would peek from the hallway, smiling like he couldn't believe this life was his. There was love, undeniable love, but time has its own language. As Kyle's company grew, so did his schedule. There were flights, meetings, new partnerships. His phone never stopped vibrating. Dinners were often late. Some nights, not at all. Isolde understood at first. She told herself this was temporary, that every business had seasons, that he was building something important for their family. But silence has a way of settling into the spaces where attention used to live. She started saving things to tell him. Little things. Things that once would have made him laugh or lean in. But days would pass. Then weeks. And eventually, she stopped saving them. He still kissed her forehead in the mornings. He still told the kids he loved them at bedtime. But those small gestures felt like echoes. Kind, yes, but distant. Faint reminders of a closeness that used to feel unshakable. She'd sit on the porch some evenings holding a cup of tea gone cold and wonder if this was just how love matured or how it disappeared. Still, she tried. She planned weekend trips he always had to cancel. She suggested a date night. He pushed it 2 weeks, then forgot. So she bought a new dress, one that felt unlike her. Bright red. Fitted. When he came home that night, she stood at the top of the stairs, nervous, hopeful. He looked up, nodded once, and said, "You look different." Then he walked into his office and shut the door. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't anger. It was something worse. Disinterest. She didn't cry right away. She cleaned the kitchen. She folded laundry. She packed the kids' lunches. And when the house was finally quiet, she sat on the edge of their bed and whispered, "Where did you go?" Not out loud, just enough for her own ears. And for the first time since they met, she felt alone. Not because he had left, but because he was still there, and no longer reaching for her. The invitation said celebration. The venue said success. But to Isolde, it felt like survival. Kyle's company had just signed a massive international deal. A milestone. There were rooftop views, tall glasses, louder laughter than she was used to. Everyone was polished, tailored, styled, trained to speak in headlines. Isolde stood near the glass railing, hands wrapped tightly around a flute of sparkling juice. She wore a golden silk gown a stylist picked for her. Her curls had been pulled and pressed into a sleek shape that made her feel like someone else's shadow. She smiled. She greeted people warmly. She asked about families, commented on earrings, made others feel seen. But he never looked at her. Kyle was across the space, animated, alive in ways she hadn't seen in months, but not with her. He stood beside a woman named Saren, tall, confident, always camera-ready. A senior executive at the company now, often seated beside him in photos, often flying on the same jets. Isolde noticed them laughing. She wasn't watching them, but her name was mentioned. That's what made her ears tilt. "She tries," Kyle said, in that half-charming, half-careless tone he used when he was trying to be liked. He nodded toward her across the crowd, the woman he once swore he'd always see. "But let's be honest," he added, "the glam life's never been her thing." Laughter. From Saren. From him. From others. Isolde didn't flinch. Not then. Not where anyone could see. But something inside her cracked, not loud enough to echo, just enough to change her shape forever. She made an excuse. Stepped outside to the quieter edge of the rooftop. Breathed deeply. She didn't cry. She just stood there, in the dress, in the skin, in the silence, and realized something no woman ever wants to know. She had become invisible to the man who once told her she was unforgettable. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and the house had gone still, she sat in Lyra's room, the smallest one, painted pale blue with star-shaped nightlights on the ceiling. Her daughter's breath was soft, warm, steady. Isolde whispered, more to herself than anyone, "I'll show them what real grace looks like." And in that moment, she didn't feel small. She felt sharp. Have you ever fallen for someone who made you feel truly seen, at first? Tell us in the comments. Your story might inspire someone today. Success doesn't knock. It doesn't ask for permission. It moves in. One morning, Kyle was helping Oren build a model rocket on the porch. The next he was flying out before breakfast, phone already pressed to his ear. At first, Isolde didn't mind. She knew what he was building. She believed in it. She believed in him. She packed his bags with care, left notes inside his folders, recorded bedtime stories so the kids could hear her voice when he was away. They still had their moments, but those moments grew thin, stretched between meetings, blurred between flights. She started keeping a little notebook of things she wanted to tell him. Funny things the kids said, new recipes, the way Lyra twirled when no one was watching. Just little moments, their moments. The notebook filled, but the conversations didn't come, because by the time Kyle came home, he was already tired. Too tired to talk, too tired to listen, too tired to see the woman who waited all day just to hear how he was really doing. He still loved her, or maybe he loved the idea of her, the way she held the home together, the way she made everything feel grounded. But loving someone from a distance, it creates a gap, and in that gap something else grew, expectation. One night, Kyle came home from a speaking event in San Francisco. He walked into the kitchen and paused when he saw her. Isolde was wearing a soft gray dress, no makeup, hair still in its usual twist. Dinner was warm. The kids were excited. Music played low. He smiled briefly, then said, not cruelly but not kindly, "You know, you'd look amazing if you just did something different with your hair." She blinked, laughed a little, thought maybe he was joking, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. It started like that. Not sharp words, not shouting, just suggestions. "You should try dressing like the other wives. This is an important dinner. Maybe something more upscale? You don't have to change, just try." She didn't know when her skin began to feel foreign, when her hands started shaking slightly while picking an outfit. When the mirror started feeling like a test, she kept failing. She agreed to a stylist, someone Kyle's assistant recommended. Young, always dressed in black, with sharp nails and a sharper voice. The stylist brought clothes that clung to her body in ways that made her uncomfortable. She told Isolde, "You're lovely, you just need to show it more." And Isolde, who once felt beautiful in old sweaters and wild curls, started, letting strangers decide what parts of her were worth presenting. She didn't recognize herself in photos anymore. Kyle noticed the change, but not in the way she hoped. He didn't say, "You look beautiful." He said, This is what I'm talking about. You finally look like you belong." And that word, belong, stuck to her like dust. Because for the first time in her marriage, she realized he didn't love where she came from. He loved pulling her out of it. Her name was Saren. Isolde first heard it in passing, a new executive KL hired to oversee branding and investor relations. A woman from the city, sharp-minded, fast-talking, always dressed like the cover of a magazine. Kyle mentioned her casually. "She's brilliant," he said. "Real asset to the company. Think you'd like her?" Isolde smiled, nodded, said all the right things, but that was before the name started appearing. Everywhere. It was on Kyle's lips more often than her own. She pulled off that investor dinner in 2 days. "Saren thinks we should expand into media. Saren's got an eye for presentation. You should hear her talk about market presence." At first, Isolde told herself she was being insecure, paranoid, immature. But then came the missed family dinners, the late-night texts, the way his eyes lit up when he read an email he didn't share, the sudden awareness that his attention was no longer a shared resource. It was hers once, entirely. Now it was elsewhere, somewhere she couldn't reach. Saren wasn't rude. In fact, when they finally met at a business dinner, she was perfectly polite, charismatic, smart, confident, everything Kyle used to say Isolde was. She complimented Isolde's earrings, made a light joke about Kyle's terrible parking, even offered to help her with a social media campaign for the art center. But it was in the way she looked at Kyle and the way he looked back that something unspoken passed between them. Not infidelity, not yet, but familiarity, comfort, the kind that used to belong to Isolde. That night, Kyle didn't say much on the drive home. Isolde stared out the window, her fingers curled around the strap of her purse like it could anchor her to something real. "Saren's impressive," she said finally. He nodded. "Yeah, she's sharp. She seems close to you." He shrugged. "We work well together. She gets it." "Gets what? The ambition? The lifestyle?" "The unspoken pressure to perform, not just in business, but in appearance, in tone, in how easily one could be packaged and presented." Isolde didn't ask, because in that moment she knew. He wasn't just growing distant, he was replacing the things that once made her special, with someone who knew how to fit the frame, The worst part? She started blaming herself. Maybe she'd gotten too comfortable. Maybe she should have tried harder. Maybe loving someone with all your softness wasn't enough when the world kept rewarding hard edges. She stayed up late one night and scrolled through old photos, the ones before the company. Exploded. Before the staff, the events, the articles, the new apartment in the city. Back when they danced barefoot in the living room. Back when he couldn't go a day without touching her face like she was a secret he'd just discovered. She missed that version of him. But more than that, she missed herself. The silence between them wasn't loud. That's what made it so hard to explain. There were no fights, no slamming doors, no cruel words thrown like knives across a room. Just long stretches of nothing, empty spaces where connection used to live. Kyle still came home, still ate dinner, still asked about the kids' homework, but he stopped asking about her. Not once did he say, "How was your day?" Not once did he notice when she started wearing the same cardigan for 3 days in a row. Not once did he see how her smile no longer reached her eyes. And when she stopped talking, he didn't ask why. She began to fade inside her own life. She still packed school lunches, still walked Lyra to ballet, still left sticky notes for Oren in his backpack. She still hosted art days for the neighborhood kids. But she stopped painting. She stopped singing in the kitchen, stopped calling her sister just to laugh, stopped humming herself to sleep. Because something inside her was dimming, not because she was weak, but because the person who once protected her light now acted like it didn't matter if it went out. She overheard Cale one evening during a virtual board meeting. His camera was muted, but his voice wasn't. Someone made a joke about traditional wives not understanding the pressure of being in tech. Kyle chuckled. "Yeah, Isolde is sweet," he said, "but she's not built for this world. She's more comfortable with crayons than contracts." The men laughed. Isolde stood outside the office door, holding a tray of tea she'd planned to surprise him with. She set it down quietly on the hallway table, not because she was angry, but because she didn't recognize the man inside that room anymore. One night, Kyle came home from a late dinner, another essential meeting, and found Isolde in the living room folding laundry. He barely looked at her as he walked past, loosening his tie. She said quietly, "You didn't text." He nodded. "Got busy." She tried again. "I was worried." His voice was flat. "I'm not a teenager, Isolde. I'm fine." That word again. Fine. The word people use when they don't care enough to be honest. She nodded, swallowed her response, folded another shirt. But inside her, a door closed. Later that night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror. She stared at her face, not judging it, not admiring it, just trying to remember when it stopped feeling like her own. It was supposed to be a celebration. Cale's team had closed one of the biggest international partnerships in the company's history. The venue was high above the skyline, open air, shimmering lights, endless champagne, and the kind of atmosphere built for flashbulbs and curated conversations. Isolde was there, dressed in gold, skin polished, hair pulled back, earrings selected by someone else. She had practiced her smile in the mirror that afternoon, not out of vanity, but to protect herself, because these weren't her people. These weren't her circles. And lately, she wasn't sure if Kyle was either. He didn't greet her when she arrived. He was already surrounded. Handshakes, laughter, faces too perfect to remember. He glanced her way once, nodded briefly, then turned back to a group conversation. She walked toward the bar slowly, the fabric of her dress clinging to her legs. She stood alone for a while, pretending to check her phone, sipping something she didn't want, watching. Kyle looked electric, alive, talking animatedly beside Saren, whose hand rested lightly on his forearm as she leaned in to whisper something. They both laughed. Comfortable, familiar, like a secret had passed between them. That's when she heard it. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something in her chest had already braced for impact, even before the words arrived. Kyle's voice was quieter now, speaking to two colleagues in suits. They were smiling, eyes flicking toward her, then back to him. And Kyle, the man who once wept at their wedding, the man who used to drive hours just to see her smile, said it. "She tries." He didn't pause. "But let's be honest, the glam life's never been her thing." Soft laughter. One of the men made a joke Isolde couldn't hear. She didn't need to. The damage was already done. She turned her face away so no one would see her expression shift. Not anger, not sadness, something quieter, something final. She walked to the edge of the rooftop, away from the crowd, where city lights blurred into stars and the wind brushed against her shoulders like a stranger trying to comfort someone it didn't know. She didn't cry. Instead, she watched the horizon, the buildings, the distance between who she was and who she had become in his world. He had made her feel like home once. Now she felt like furniture, necessary, present, but unremarkable. And that was the moment. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. That was the moment she knew he had stopped seeing her. And worse, she had stopped seeing herself. That night, long after the music faded and the praise wore off, Isolde sat alone in the children's room. She stroked Lyra's hair as her daughter slept. She looked down at Oren's drawing on the floor, a picture of their family, all holding hands, smiling with wide eyes. And she whispered, not with bitterness, but with clarity, "I'll show them what grace really looks like." That night, after the rooftop celebration, Isolde didn't argue. She didn't confront Kael or pack her bags. There were no ultimatums. Instead, she sat on the edge of her daughter's bed, watching Lyra sleep. The little girl's fingers were curled into a fist, clutching a small stuffed bear. Her chest rose and fell softly. Her face was peaceful, untouched by shame, untouched by being overlooked. Isolde ran a hand across Lyra's forehead and whispered, "I'm still here." But even she wasn't sure who I was anymore. The next morning she woke before everyone else. The house was silent. No boiling kettle, no clatter of breakfast, no footsteps or phones ringing. She walked to the living room, barefoot, and pulled open the old storage cabinet. Inside, beneath kids' crafts and half-used journals, was something she hadn't touched in over a decade. A leather-bound songbook, edges worn, pages filled with lyrics scribbled during her high school years, margins crowded with thoughts she never said out loud. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The words weren't polished. Some were awkward, some didn't rhyme, but they were hers. Isolde had always loved music, before Kael, before the children, before becoming someone who kept everything running but forgot to breathe for herself. She used to write songs just to feel her own thoughts take shape. But the years had swept that part of her under daily routines, school pickups, business events, and eventually, silence. Now, staring at those old lyrics, something stirred. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't anger. It was something older, deeper, a voice inside her that had gone quiet. Until now. She waited until the kids were in bed that night. Kael was on a call in his office, distracted as always. She sat in the guest room, opened her laptop and searched open mic nights near me. She found one at a cafe 15 minutes away, small, unassuming, a place she'd driven past for years without noticing. She signed up, closed the laptop, and whispered to herself, "One song. That's all." The night of the open mic, she almost didn't go. Her hands felt cold on the steering wheel. Her stomach kept turning. She had no stage name, no following, no clue if her voice would even hold steady. But she went. She wore jeans and a loose shirt. No glam, no pretense, just herself. When she stepped up to the mic, the host smiled and asked her name. "Isolde," she said. The mic crackled softly as she adjusted it. The room was half full. A few people sipped coffee. A couple whispered. Someone coughed. She cleared her throat, took a breath, and began to sing. The song was called Unseen. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, she felt her own heart move with her voice. She wasn't performing. She was reclaiming something. When she finished, there was silence. Then, light applause. Not roaring, not dramatic, but sincere. One woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man came up after and said, "That felt like something I needed to hear." She thanked them, drove home. Didn't tell Kael. But in the mirror that night, for the first time in a long time, she looked herself in the eye and didn't turn away. Isolde didn't tell anyone what she was doing. Not because she was hiding, because this part of her was still fragile, like skin after a burn. It needed time. Privacy. A chance to grow without being judged too early. So she created a new schedule. 2 nights a week, after the children were in bed, and Kael was wrapped up in calls or travel plans. She'd leave the house quietly and drive to places no one from his world would recognize. Cafes, libraries, community centers, even a converted laundromat that doubled as a poetry club on Thursdays. She brought her notebook. She brought her voice. She brought the parts of herself that had been waiting for years to speak again. The first few shows were small, quiet. Sometimes people talked through her set. Sometimes no one clapped. But she kept going. She began filming herself, reviewing posture, tone, breathing. She watched videos online, taught herself how to improve vocal control, how to shape emotion into melody. Each night she sang, her voice grew steadier. Each night she stood before strangers, her spine straightened a little more. She began writing new songs, songs that didn't ask permission, songs that didn't hide behind metaphors, songs that told the truth about marriage, about motherhood, about disappearing inside someone else's dreams. She titled them like journal entries, too quiet to hear, what I gave up, held together by routines, when he stopped asking, and each one peeled back another layer of numbness. Not all were good, but all were honest. And in a world obsessed with polish, her honesty made people stop scrolling. It started with a clip posted by a teenager at one of the cafes. Just a shaky phone video with the caption, "This woman's voice broke me in the best way. She said what no one else does." It didn't go viral overnight. It took a few weeks. Then came the comments. "Who is she? I felt this in my bones. She's not singing, she's telling the truth." Isolde didn't check the video until someone sent it to her anonymously through her community arts group page. It had over 40,000 views. She stared at the number for a long time, not with pride, with disbelief, because she hadn't gone out looking for attention. She went out looking for herself, and somehow, the world found her. The message came on a Wednesday. Isolde was folding laundry in the living room, Lyra's socks in one pile, Oren's shirts in another, when her phone buzzed. It was an email. Subject line, "Heard you sing. You made me stop breathing." She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short note from someone named Carmen Blake, a scout for a regional music label. Carmen had seen the cafe video, the one a stranger posted weeks ago, and asked if Isolde would be willing to talk. "You don't need a viral voice, you need a truthful one. You have that. Don't ignore it." Isolde reread the message 5 times. Then she closed the laptop and sat there, unmoving, surrounded by laundry, overwhelmed by something that felt like both possibility and fear. She didn't tell Kyle. That weekend, she met Carmen at a tiny studio tucked behind an old bookstore. Carmen was in her 50s, hair streaked with silver, eyes sharp but kind. She didn't ask for credentials, didn't want numbers. She wanted one thing: sing like no one's listening. Isolde did. One song. And when she finished, Carmen stood silently for a few seconds, then said, "You're not an act. You're a message." Carmen told her about the Heart Song Festival, one of the most celebrated national music showcases. Broadcast live, millions of viewers, huge platform. Most of the finalists, she explained, have teams, producers, press, plans. Then she leaned forward. "But none of them have your story." Isolde didn't say yes right away. She went home, tucked her songbook beneath the bed, and cleaned the kitchen. She folded clothes, packed school bags, went through every quiet motion of motherhood, but something inside her had already shifted, because someone, a stranger, had just offered her a stage not built for perfection, but for meaning. She applied for the Heart Song Festival without telling anyone. She uploaded one video, raw, recorded in her guest room with a desk lamp and her old guitar. She didn't rehearse it 10 times, didn't auto-tune, didn't even put on makeup. She just told the truth, with melody. Then she hit submit and waited. Days passed, then weeks. Life went on. Kyle was busy prepping for another product launch, flying to 3 cities in 6 days. Saren was at the house twice, dropping off files, giving updates, sipping espresso. Kyle brewed for her, but never offered to Isolde. Isolde stayed quiet, not because she was afraid, because this was hers. And some things are too sacred to explain to people who never cared to ask. Late one night, her phone lit up. "Congratulations, you've been selected to perform live at the Heart Song Festival." She didn't scream. She didn't even smile. She just sat in the dark and let her heart finally beat without restraint. The weeks leading up to the festival felt like a dream made of silence. No press, no glam squad, no stylists knocking on her door. Just her, a notebook, a guitar, and a voice that finally felt like her own again. She practiced late at night while the house slept. She recorded herself on old equipment. She adjusted pitch, worked on breath control, rewrote lyrics until her fingers cramped. Every lyric was carved from something she had once been too polite to say. Kyle never asked why she seemed different. He didn't notice she'd stopped wearing the clothes his assistant picked out. He didn't notice she'd removed the expensive necklace he once gave her, the one she wore out of habit, not affection. He didn't notice the candlelit evenings in the guest room, where music hummed softly behind closed doors. He didn't ask, so she didn't explain. Carmen visited a few times, not to change her, just to guide. You don't have to be loud to be unforgettable, she told her. You just have to be honest. They rehearsed in old halls and makeshift studios. Sometimes they'd break to drink tea and talk about things that had nothing to do with music, healing, shame, rebuilding. Tell me why this matters to you, Carmen said one evening. Isolde looked up, expression steady. Because I want my daughter to see what it looks like when a woman refuses to disappear. As the festival approached, Isolde stood on the edge of two lives. In one, she was still the woman who packed lunches, attended parent-teacher meetings, and listened to Kyle talk about numbers she no longer pretended to understand. In the other, she was someone waking up again, someone no longer performing a role that had stopped fitting long ago. The duality was strange. She'd serve breakfast in the morning, then rehearse before bed with a microphone taped to a broomstick. She'd listen to Lyra read bedtime stories, then sing those same words into melodies just to practice keeping her pitch steady while holding emotion. She wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing wholeness. The night before she left for the Heartsong Festival, she tucked the children in, kissed their foreheads, and stood in the hallway longer than usual. Kyle was out of town, a product expo in Milan. He hadn't asked where she would be. She didn't tell him, because for once, she didn't need him to know. Her suitcase was small. She packed only what she needed. A deep green dress she found in a thrift shop, her guitar, her songbook, and a photo of the children, taken back when Kale still held her hand without being reminded. In her hotel room that night, she stood barefoot, staring at the stage schedule taped to the wall. She traced her name with her fingertip. Isolde Evan, performer 12th, live broadcast. She didn't know if she would win, but that wasn't why she was there. She was there because she had once been forgotten by the person who promised to see her forever. She was there because she had stayed silent for too long. She was there because sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is simply being fully yourself in front of people who only remember who you used to be. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and whispered to herself, "You're not doing this to be chosen. You're doing this because you already are. If you've ever had to start over, from the ashes of who you were," comment rising below. "Let's celebrate those who rise." The lights dimmed. The crowd grew quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, the kind that feels holy. Isolde stood behind the curtain, one hand resting over her stomach, the other gently gripping the neck of her guitar. Her heart wasn't racing. It was steady, like it had been waiting for this all along. The MC's voice echoed softly through the speakers. Up next, a first-time performer from Riverbend, Isolde Evan. A ripple of polite applause. She stepped forward, not with a flourish, not with a practiced smile, just with presence. The lights caught her emerald green dress as she crossed the stage. It wasn't glossy or sharp. It was soft, flowing, unapologetically grounded, like something you'd wear when you've stopped trying to be someone else. Her hair was down. Her shoes were flat. Her eyes, focused. She sat on the lone stool at center stage, adjusted the mic, cleared her throat once, and then, with no background music, no fireworks, she began to sing. The first word trembled, but only for a second. Then came the next, and the next, until suddenly the room wasn't just listening, it was leaning in. The song was called Unseen, and every lyric hit like truth spoken at a family dinner. Raw, gentle, impossible to ignore. I made myself small so you could stand tall. I wore the silence like pearls in your crowded halls. I gave you my eyes and you looked away, but I still sang through the parts you erased. She didn't cry. She didn't push emotion into her voice to win the crowd. She let the lyrics carry everything, years of betrayal, the ache of invisibility, the courage it took to keep showing up. At one point, a woman in the second row covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming. A man in a suit closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath. The judges had stopped taking notes. They were just watching. And across the country, in a luxury villa with glass walls and too much gold, Kyle stared at the screen, frozen. Saren was beside him, swirling a glass of wine, her phone buzzing from group texts. But Kyle couldn't move, because there she was, not the woman he left behind at events, not the woman who asked him gently to listen, not the woman who folded clothes while he planned empires. A different woman, a woman he never bothered to meet. Isolde's voice quivered on the bridge, not from nerves but from truth trying to escape all at once. I lived in your shadow, but I kept the light. I turned my pain into something that writes. Saren shifted beside him. Wait, is that... Kyle didn't answer. He couldn't, because he'd finally seen her, and it broke something in him. The final note lingered in the air, soft, full, and unafraid. Then came the silence. Not confusion, not delay. It was the silence that only follows something honest. And then, the first clap, then another, then all at once, like something breaking open, the audience stood. Not because she hit a high note, but because she'd told their stories too. Isolde stood slowly, nodding once in quiet gratitude, her hands still loose at her sides. She didn't bow. She didn't bask. She just stood in that glow, not the stage lights, but the warmth of being seen for real. A judge stood, wiping her cheek. The host stood beside her, mouth parted, not yet ready to speak. And in the back row, a young woman in a hoodie held up her phone, whispering, "This woman, she's everything." The clip would go viral within hours. Online, the reaction was immediate. Who is this woman? I'm sobbing. She just said everything I've never had the words for. Bookmark this moment. We just witnessed a life change in real time. She doesn't sing. She reminds you of who you are. Her name began to spread, not through marketing, but through shared emotion. Sold Evan, unseen but heard Sis's Grace, the song that stopped me. Clips flooded every platform, not just from the official broadcast, but from strangers in the audience, who knew they had just experienced something unforgettable. Back at the villa, Kyle was still standing. Saren looked over at him, cautious now. She's good. I didn't know she... He raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to steady himself. He hadn't blinked in what felt like minutes. There was no applause in the room, no crowd, just the hum of the television and the uncomfortable weight of realization pressing into his chest. He watched as the screen cut to the panel of judges. One leaned into the mic, voice trembling. That wasn't a performance. That was a testimony. Kyle turned off the screen. He didn't speak. He didn't leave the room. He just stood there, not thinking, just remembering. He remembered her old notebooks, the way she used to hum while making dinner, the voice he used to barely hear, not because it was faint, but because he never listened. He remembered the first time he told her she looked beautiful with no makeup, and the last time he even said the word. He remembered her holding Oren at 3 a.m., exhausted but gentle, and how he'd walked past them, muttering about sleep instead of sitting beside her. He remembered her standing in the kitchen last winter, asking quietly, "Do you still see me?" He had said yes, but he hadn't looked up. He walked outside. The night was still. He didn't cry, but something in him folded, not from guilt, not from shame, from the recognition that he had missed the greatest thing he'd ever been given, not when she left, but while she stayed. The next morning, Isolde sat alone in her hotel room. No fanfare, no press knocking at the door, no manager with a phone full of offers, just the soft rustling of a notepad beside her and the blinking light. Of her phone, 1,038 new notifications. She turned it face down. She wasn't ready for the noise. Not yet. She walked to the window, opened the curtain halfway, and let the light in. It hit her skin differently now, not because she looked any different, but because she felt returned to herself. This wasn't glory. It wasn't fame. It was relief. Relief that the world had heard what she had carried in silence. Relief that she hadn't vanished trying to keep someone else's life polished. Relief that her truth had value, even when it wasn't perfectly presented. Across the city, Carmen sat in a coffee shop, scrolling through reactions. Producers were reaching out. publications requesting interviews, labels asking for meetings. But Carmen didn't call Isolde right away. She knew this wasn't about the buzz. It was about a woman who once sat across from her and said, "I'm not trying to become something. I'm trying to stop hiding." Back home, in the house they once built together, Kyle stood in the kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee. His phone had been ringing since early morning. Texts from friends, board members forwarding clips. Saren had called twice. He didn't answer. He scrolled slowly through the comments beneath the video, not the corporate ones, but the real ones. "I left a man like this once. I wish I had her voice. This is what it looks like when a woman saves herself. If my daughter ever feels small, I'll play her this." Each comment was like a mirror, but not the kind that reflects, the kind that confronts. He walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, and pulled out the dress Isolde had worn to that rooftop event. It was still hanging there, still golden, still perfect. But now it looked hollow, like something that had been placed on a mannequin, not a person. He stared at it, not because it was beautiful, but because he remembered how she stood in it that night, smiling through a loneliness he never asked about. Later that evening, Oren and Lyra returned from school. Kyle sat with them at the table, asked about their day, listened, really listened. Oren looked up and said, "Did you see Mom's song?" Kyle nodded. "Yeah." Lyra chimed in. "She looked so happy." He smiled. Soft, small. She did. Neither child knew the full weight of what had changed, but they could feel it, the shift in the air, the way their father's silence was different now, less distracted, more still. Isolde returned home 3 days later, not to the house, not to Kyle, to her best friend's place, a small house near the edge of town, filled with warm light, soft blankets, and a kettle that never seemed to stop singing. She needed time, not space. She'd had plenty of that. She needed stillness that wasn't lonely, a room where she didn't have to be anything but herself. Kyle called the next morning. He didn't leave a long message, just said, "When you're ready, I'd like to talk." She waited a few days, then texted him, "By the lake. Tomorrow." Before sunset, he arrived before she did. The same lake where they were married, the same dock, even the same folding chairs, though now a little rusted around the edges. When Isolde walked up, she wasn't wearing the dress from the stage. She wore jeans, a soft blue sweater, no makeup. She looked like peace that took a long time to earn. They sat in silence for a while. He was the first to speak. "I didn't know," he said quietly. She looked out over the water. "You stopped asking?" He nodded. "I thought I was building something for us." "You were building something," she replied, "but it stopped being for us a long time ago." He swallowed hard. "I watched you sing." "I know. I didn't recognize you." She turned to him then, calm, clear. "That's because I'm finally myself." Kyle looked down. His voice cracked a little. "I failed you." She didn't rush to respond, because she didn't need to offer comfort anymore. Instead, she said, "You stopped seeing me, long before you replaced me." He closed his eyes, breath shaky. "I didn't mean to." "I know," she cut in gently. "That's what makes it worse." They sat with that truth, let it settle. Then she said what she came to say. "I forgive you," not because he'd earned it, not because he asked for it, because she was no longer willing to carry the weight of what he broke. He looked up, tears finally welling in his eyes. "I want to be better. For the kids. For—" She shook her head. "Not for me. Not anymore." Then added softly, "But for them, yes. Show them what change looks like." He nodded, wiping his face. There was no begging, no bargaining, just two people sitting by a lake where something once bloomed and now had grown into something else entirely. Not a rekindling, a reckoning. That night, she returned to her friend's house, opened her notebook, wrote a new song title on the top of the page, "Stayed Too Quiet," and beneath it, one sentence: "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing not to bleed for someone else's wound." The next morning, Isolde packed 2 small suitcases, one for Oren, one for Lyra. She didn't take much else. No grand speech, no slammed doors, no drama, just a soft conversation at the kitchen table. "We're going to stay at Auntie Marie's for a while," she told them. Oren blinked. "Are you and Dad okay?" She smiled gently. "We're all going to be okay, but right now we need a little space to think and feel." Lyra asked if she could bring her sketchbook. Isolde nodded. "Of course, baby. Bring all of you." Kyle stood in the doorway, silent, not because he disagreed, because he knew it had to happen. He wanted to protest, wanted to say, "Let's talk first or we can fix it." But deep inside he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't about punishment. It was about pause. That night, after the kids were asleep in Marie's guest room, Isolde sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, sipping warm tea. She didn't cry. She didn't scroll. She just breathed. For the first time in years, there was no pressure to explain who she was, to prove her worth, to shrink or stretch to fit someone else's comfort. She was just here, and it was enough. Back at the house, Kyle sat on the floor of the hallway, where little handprints from Oren and Lyra's birthday still faintly decorated the wall. He finally let himself break, not in a theatrical way, not out of regret for what he'd lost publicly. He mourned what he had neglected, what he took for granted, what he never made room to cherish. He texted Isolde the next day. "I'm sorry, not for the outcome, for how long it took me to see. Thank you for taking care of our kids when I didn't know how to be present. I'm going to change, whether you see it or not, because they deserve that, and so do you." She read the message, sat with it, said nothing back, not because she was cold, because some things take time to absorb, and not every apology needs an immediate answer. The days passed in gentle rhythm, mornings of cartoons and cereal, afternoons filled with music, library visits, laughter, evenings where Isolde and Marie would sit in quiet reflection, not fixing each other, just listening. One evening, Lyra asked, "Do you still love Daddy?" Isolde held her close, thought carefully, then said, "I love the part of him that gave me you." Lyra nodded, like she understood. Even if only a little, the love story was changing, not ending, not reviving, just shifting into a new form, where love meant something different now, not holding on, but letting go with grace. Kyle didn't post anything online, no cryptic quotes, no public apologies, no self-praise disguised as reflection. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for something that felt foreign to him. How do you rebuild trust when you've broken it? The results were humbling. Therapists, group sessions, books with titles that didn't promise quick fixes, just slow change. He chose one, a small practice 2 towns over, quiet, no marble floors or glass doors, just a woman in her 50s named Ruth who asked, "Why now?" He sat for a moment, then answered honestly, "Because my daughter asked if her mom still loved me, and I realized I don't know how to love myself without being admired by strangers." He went back every week. Sometimes he talked. Other times he sat in silence while Ruth said nothing, just held space the way Isolde once had. At first, it was unbearable. To sit in stillness without validation, to look at the mirror without excuses. But week after week, the silence stopped feeling like a punishment. It started feeling like practice. He also changed how he showed up for Oren and Lyra, not with grand gestures, with presence. No more late-night flights, no last-minute cancellations, no calls with Seren. That chapter had quietly ended, without ceremony, just closure. He started picking Lyra up from her art classes, started asking Oren questions that weren't about school, but about feelings. He burned pancakes twice and let them eat the bad ones anyway, laughing through the mess. At bedtime, he told them, "I'm learning how to be better, not for praise, just because I want to be the kind of man you both feel safe with." At first, they didn't respond much. Children are cautious with hope. But slowly, something softened. Oren stopped flinching when Kyle walked into a room. Lyra started drawing more pictures of Daddy's house again, and this time, the windows had lights. Isolde watched from a distance. She didn't interfere. She didn't hand out stars or warnings. She just observed, because real change doesn't need an audience. It reveals itself in consistency. Meanwhile, she kept singing, not in arenas, not yet, but in local halls, in women's shelters, in church basements filled with folding chairs and women who clutched every word like it was their own memory. One evening, after a small show in a town nearby, an older woman hugged her tightly and whispered, "Your voice gave me the courage to finally say goodbye." That's when Isolde realized. She wasn't performing anymore. She was offering freedom. Not just to herself, but to anyone who'd ever been told they were too quiet to be powerful. The lake hadn't changed. Still calm. Still gold at sunset. Still holding echoes of laughter from a day long past. The day they promised forever. Kyle waited there, hands in his jacket pockets, heart pounding slower than it used to. Not with nerves, with weight. Isolde arrived with a quiet presence. She wore no makeup, no performance, just herself, steady, complete. He stood as she approached, unsure of how to begin. She spoke first. "Why here?" He looked at the water. "Because this is where I first told you I'd never stop seeing your soul." A pause. "And now?" He swallowed. "Now I'm learning how to see it without needing to control it." They sat on the same old bench, just far enough apart that they weren't pretending this was something it wasn't. He didn't apologize again. Not with words. He had said enough. Instead, he asked, "How are you, really?" She nodded slowly. "At peace. Some days are still heavy, but they're mine now. And that changes everything." He looked down. "I didn't know how to love you without trying to shape you." She didn't soften the truth. "You stopped loving me the moment I stopped fitting your world." He winced, not because it was cruel, because it was true. A long silence followed, the kind that once would have terrified Kyle. Now he sat with it, allowed it. Finally he whispered, "I'm not asking for us back." She turned to him, surprised. "I'm asking if I can still be a good father. If I can still be someone who shows up the right way, not for what it brings me, but for what it gives them." Her eyes filled gently. "You already are. Just keep going." He nodded. No pleading, no expectations. Just release. They sat a while longer, watching the light bend across the lake, both knowing that this was the real goodbye. Not of love, of the version of love that forgot how to listen. What does forgiveness mean to you? Is it a second chance, or is it setting yourself free? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's have an honest moment. No judgment, just truth. Months passed. The headlines faded. The festival buzz cooled. But Isolde wasn't waiting for cameras anymore. She began recording songs, not for radio hits, but for the women in shelters who said her voice felt like home. She collaborated with poets, counselors, choir groups. She showed up in places where people came not for noise, but for healing. Her music became a bridge, not a brand. Oren started piano lessons. Lyra, now older, began journaling her own lyrics, stories of strength, kindness, starting over. Sometimes they'd all sit on the living room rug, sharing sounds, making mistakes, laughing without pressure. That laughter, not applause, was what Isolde lived for now. Kyle never asked to come back, and that, in itself, was growth. He showed up for school plays, for birthdays, for hard talks about feelings. He didn't arrive with gifts. He arrived with presence. He didn't try to rewrite history. He tried to understand it. Isolde noticed. And though the love they once shared had changed shape, it now had something it never did before. Balance. One evening, nearly 2 years after the festival, Isolde stood behind the curtain at Madison Square Garden. It wasn't nerves that filled her chest, it was gratitude. The stage was massive. The crowd was waiting, but she wasn't performing to prove anymore. She was there to offer. Behind her, Oren whispered, "You got this, Mom." Lyra grinned, holding her hand. "You're magic." Kyle sat in the front row, quiet, steady, changed. The lights rose, and Isolde stepped forward, not as someone discovered or made, as someone who had simply become. She once gave her heart to a man who stopped seeing her light. Now, she shines with such quiet power. The world can't look away. The crowd murmured with anticipation, camera phones in every direction. Some fans wore shirts with her lyrics. Others held signs that read, "Unseen, but never again." Grace has a sound, and it's hers. Backstage, Isolde stood still, eyes closed. Her hands didn't tremble. Her heart wasn't racing. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. The curtains were thick, but the sound from the crowd was unmistakable. It wasn't just excitement. It was reverence. Oren peeked through a gap in the velvet and let out a tiny gasp. "Mom," he whispered, "it's full." Lyra hugged her from behind, resting her chin on Isolde's shoulder. "They're here for you. All of you." Kyle stood with them. He wasn't center stage. Not beside her. Not behind her. Just near enough for the children to see him. And that was enough. No grand gestures, no spotlight seeking, only presence. The stage director gave the signal. The lights lowered. A hush swept over thousands of people as one voice was announced. Please welcome Isolde. She stepped forward slowly, not like someone about to impress, like someone about to tell the truth. The spotlight kissed her gently. Emerald silk shimmered against her skin, her curls free and unbothered. She carried no burden, no mask. The only thing she brought to the stage was herself. She walked to the microphone, paused, and looked across the sea of people. And then she smiled, not the kind she used to offer to blend in or calm a room. This smile said, I am here, and I'm not hiding anymore. She began with Unseen, the same song that once carried her from heartbreak to healing. But tonight, it wasn't a wound. It was a declaration. Her voice filled the garden like it had been waiting to live in that. Space all along, soft in the verses, unshakable in the chorus. And in the front row, Oren stood up first. Lyra followed, her hands over her heart. Kyle stayed seated, but his eyes never left the stage. There was no longing in his gaze, only respect, and the weight of lessons learned. The final notes soared, the lights pulsed, the crowd erupted. But Isolde just stood there, hand over her chest, grounded in one truth. She didn't need this stage to know her worth, but it was sweet to stand on it anyway. Somewhere between grief and grace, she had found herself, not in applause, not in revenge, but in the quiet spaces where no one else was watching. Those late nights at the kitchen table, writing lyrics with a tired heart. The trembling first time she stood on a makeshift stage at a local cafe. The car rides with her children, singing freely with the windows down. These were the moments that built her, not the spotlight, the shadows she had walked through to reach it. She remembered the way she used to shrink, apologizing with her posture, smiling to survive rooms that never felt safe, wearing what she was told, saying less than she felt, shrinking into silence when she wanted to sing. She remembered the way she used to beg for someone to see her, the ache of invisibility in a house where love used to live. But something had shifted. She had stopped asking to be chosen and started choosing herself. Isolde learned that peace isn't loud. It doesn't beg to be heard. It hums, steady, honest, whole. She no longer needed validation like oxygen. She breathed on her own now. Looking back, it wasn't that Kyle was a villain. He was human, and sometimes being human means forgetting how to love something that doesn't reflect who you think you are. But she remembered. She remembered who she was when no one clapped, who she was when no one praised her reflection, who she was when the house grew cold and the silence screamed louder than any insult. She didn't break. She rebuilt, and in that rebuilding she discovered this truth. You don't become powerful by being seen. You become powerful by seeing yourself fully and refusing to look away. Kyle didn't chase cameras anymore. He wasn't on magazine covers. He didn't post curated photos of perfect dinners or brand partnerships. He still had the money, still had the business, but he had learned how expensive it is to ignore someone's soul. That lesson cost him a marriage. It cost him a version of fatherhood he'd once taken for granted. It cost him the right to call Isolde his without earning it. But he paid it, with silence, with apologies that asked for nothing in return, with presence that didn't ask to be praised. He went to therapy, not because someone told him to, but because he couldn't stand who he had become. He showed up for the kids, not just with gifts, but with time. School runs, teacher meetings, quiet evenings where Oren taught him chords and Lyra read him poems she was too shy to share with anyone else. He learned how to listen, how to admit when he was wrong, how to sit in discomfort without shifting blame. He never tried to win Isolde back. He knew better now. He knew that love is not ownership, that apologies don't entitle you to a second chance, only the chance to grow. And still, he was there. Every concert, every parent meeting, every whispered moment when the kids needed both their parents to stand on the same side of the room. He had been the man who once didn't see her light. Now, he was the man who helped their children protect it. That too was love. Not loud, but real. After the final encore, when the lights dimmed and the crowd reluctantly began to leave, Isolde didn't rush backstage. She stood at the center of the stage, alone for just a moment, taking it all in. Not the noise, not the fame, But the stillness that followed. She had once stood in a kitchen, ignored, once walked through rooms where her presence was invisible, once loved a man who saw her as decoration, not flame. Now, she burned brighter than ever, not to be admired, to be free. In the front row, Oren and Lyra held each other's hands. They didn't know every chapter of her pain, not yet, but they felt her strength. They watched her walk with a grace that couldn't be taught, heard her sing with a truth that couldn't be faked. They would remember this forever, not just as the night their mom sang at Madison Square Garden, but as the night she claimed her space in the world. Without permission, without apology, Kyle stayed seated long after most had gone. No camera captured his face. No article would tell his side. But deep inside, he whispered 2 words, the ones he should have said years ago, the ones he finally meant. Thank you. Not for what she did for him, but for reminding him of what it means to see someone, truly. And Isolde? She walked off that stage, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had returned to the version of herself that was never broken, only buried. She had loved deeply. She had hurt deeply. But now, she lived deeply. If this story lit a fire in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Mr. Ross Story Trail, because every trail leads to truth.